Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a real literary puzzle. It's one that's been around for ages. Who really wrote the works of William Shakespeare?
Yeah, it's a classic question.
And we've got some interesting material mainly coming from this YouTube video, Ben Jonson and the Shakespeare Authorship Secret. So our mission today is to really dig into the arguments presented there, see if we can pull out some of those, aha moments, maybe shift how you think about this whole thing.
It's fascinating stuff.
Absolutely. And look, whether you're deep into this debate already or it's totally new, we're going to try and make it clear, engaging, every surprises without getting too bogged down in heavy academic talk.
Right, and Ben Jonson is such a central figure here, isn't he? A contemporary, wrote the eulogy in the first folio. He should know something. But the video kicks off with this point from George Greenwood. It's about how Shakespeare's name is, well, missing.
Missing? How so?
From Jonson's personal stuff, his private writings, letters, even poems you'd expect to mention him. Nothing, despite, writing the big intro to the collected works.
Okay, hold on. So Jonson, a major literary figure, pals around in the same circles, eventually writes this famous eulogy for the works.
Uh-huh.
But in his own day-to-day letters, notes, whatever, he just doesn't mention Shakespeare the man.
Seems that way. It's a noticeable silence, isn't it?
It really is. Why? Why would he leave him out? Seems significant.
Well, the video argues Jonson wasn't totally silent, maybe just indirect. It brings up epigram 77. Jonson promises someone of so good a fame that his own work wouldn't name him outright.
Okay, and the interpretation is?
That this someone is the real author, the hidden genius behind the name. Maybe Christopher Marlowe, as the theory often goes. So Jonson's honoring a deal, basically, part of a cover-up, if you will.
A cover-up. So we're not just talking about maybe it was someone else. We're talking about a potential, genuine historical literary conspiracy.
That's the idea. Driven by danger, maybe. The real author couldn't be revealed.
Protecting an endangered, concealed poet genius, Marlowe, while putting forward this literary hoax from Stratford.
Exactly. And the video pushes it further. It wasn't just Jonson keeping mum. It suggests he had some influence, maybe even leverage over the real author.
Leverage.
How? Other epigrams, like epigram 30. Jonson seems to accuse the real Shakespeare of stealing his verses.
Jonson's verses, whoa.
Yeah, and threatens to spill the beans, reveal his name if he messes up his own reputation or, steps out of line.
So Jonson isn't just a silent partner. He's laying down conditions. Setting rules.
It paints that picture, yeah. A really complex relation, or not just admiration, maybe some tension, a power dynamic.
And there's another one, epigram 38.
Same kind of vibe. Threatening this guilty poet genius again, says he'll expose him if he loses his shame, whatever that means exactly.
A guilty poet genius. That implies an ongoing situation, doesn't it? Something they were both navigating.
Right. A constant negotiation, maybe? The real author having to stick to the rules of the game. And sticking with these coded messages, the video looks at epigram 115. This one's called A Strange Riddle About the Town's Honest Man.
Okay.
And Jonson asks, "You wonder who this is and why I name him not?"
Intriguing. So what's the allegorical reading here?
The town's honest man isn't a person, it's an an artificial creature that's supposed to represent the true, hidden Shakespeare.
An artificial creature. Interesting phrase. What does that imply?
Like something constructed, maybe? Not organic. And then it mentions his sister naked, which is interpreted as the undressed, maybe exposed Stratford Shakespeare, the front man.
And there's wordplay, too. With vice.
Yeah, exactly. A vice can mean wickedness, but it can also mean, second in command, the deputy.
So the hidden author is the real power, the vice in charge, and the Stratford guy is just the public face.
That's the argument. It adds another layer to the idea of a deliberate concealment, which naturally leads you to look at the most public face of all the first folio. Are there clues there? Misdirection.
Right. Like the portrait.
The poem with the portrait. The video focuses on the lines, "Look not on his picture."
What about them?
The argument is that's Jonson telling you straight up, this picture, it's a bombastic fake. It's not the real author.
Wow, hiding in plain sight. Is there anything else supporting that the portrait was, intentionally misleading?
Well, it ties into poem 19, where Jonson talks about his esteemed friend, the author, but again doesn't name him. And he asks almost pointedly what author would conceal his name.
It really does sound like he's dropping hints, doesn't it? Like breadcrumbs.
To my beloved, the author, it feels very specific, yet deliberately anonymous. Then the video brings up epigram 56, Poet Ape.
Poet Ape. Doesn't sound complimentary.
Not at all. The interpretation is it's a direct satirical hit on the Stratford Shakespeare.
And poet ape means
Basically a plagiarist. Someone who mimics real talent, steals work, profits from it without having the goods themselves. Jonson mentions someone running others' plays, profiting.
which kind of fits the picture of the Stratford man being more involved in the theater business, maybe. The deals, the money.
It could align with that view, yeah. Someone managing or presenting the work rather than creating it.
Okay, so let's go back to the first folio eulogy itself. Jonson describes the author as a monument without a grave, alive still, his folio book does live.
Right.
The video argues that alive still might not just be poetic license.
Exactly. Why haven't mainstream scholars maybe considered taking that more? Literally.
That the author was actually still alive when the folio came out.
It's a provocative thought, isn't it? Alive still. It jumps out. The implication being the man known as Shakespeare died, but the author lived on, under another identity maybe.
And what about the line, "Shake a spear lance at the eyes of our ignorance"?
The video sees that as another layer of meaning, an allegory, suggesting the plays themselves, the true filed lines, are meant to challenge what we think we know. Reading them properly wakes us up from our ignorance about the author.
Huh. Makes you think differently about engaging with the plays themselves.
Definitely. And it even questions the sweet swan of Avon. We all assume Stratford-upon-Avon.
Right. Where else could it be?
Well, the video suggests maybe the Avon River in Wiltshire, connecting it to Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke.
The literary patron. Why her?
She had a major literary circle there. It shifts the potential influences, the geography, away from just Stratford, opens up other possibilities for who the author was connected to.
Interesting. And the video contrasts Jonson's big folio eulogy with how he treated other poets, like Nicholas Breton.
Yeah. Jonson wrote a dedicatory poem for Breton's work during Breton's lifetime. The question is, if Jonson and Shakespeare were such pals, why no similar public praise while Shakespeare was alive? Why wait until the Folio Commission?
Good point. If he admired him so much, you'd expect something before 1623.
And the language Jonson uses for Breton is also, well, kind of cryptic. A mind attired in perfect strains, needing a lateral view to judge correctly.
Sounds like more coded language.
The video floats the idea. Maybe Breton was another pseudonym for the real author. For Marlowe,
So Marlowe, writing as Shakespeare, maybe as Breton too.
it starts to build a picture of someone operating under multiple covers. Then the discussion moves to a work called Parnassus Biceps. The idea here is that the true Shakespeare, maybe still writing as Marlowe or someone else, actually commented on his own past and on others, like Jonson.
Commented how?
Through allegory, again. There's a poem in Parnassus to the memory of Ben Jonson. The video interprets this as the real author critiquing Jonson.
Critiquing him for what?
For basically celebrating the loss of this supposed Shakespeare in the first folio, like Jonson was playing along with the myth.
So the real author is like posthumously calling Jonson out.
Or not even posthumously if he was still alive. It suggests this hidden author was reflecting on how his own story was being shaped.
That's wild. And the video even suggests Marlowe might have helped Jonson write the folio eulogy.
It adds that layer of possibility, yeah. Talk about a complex relationship.
And there's another poem mentioned, Ben Jonson to Burles, the true author shakes Marlowe.
Right. In that one, Jonson supposedly says he only knew the author superficially and basically created an archetype in the folio. A brave piece, but not like me, the line goes. Again, suggesting the public image was a construction.
Okay, back to the folio eulogy preamble, those 17 lines before the main part. Why so long?
The video argues it's unusual and signals a problem. Jonson had a tricky task.
How so?
He had to praise the work, which he genuinely admired, but if the dead Stratford man wasn't the real author and the real author was still alive, praising the wrong guy too much could be, well, awkward or even dangerous.
Ah, so he had to walk a fine line.
Seems like it. The video points to the opening lines distinguishing between name and work, suggesting the authorship issue is already kind of known, at least in some circles.
And that line, truth will emerge through chance, sounds loaded in this context.
Very, and the bit about ignorance sounding at bed, but echoes right. The video connects the sound of shack or Shakespeare to Shakespeare, like a deliberate, maybe slightly mocking echo, a hint about the name itself.
Clever wordplay, if true. What about epigram 89? To Edward Allen, the actor.
On the surface, it's just praise for Allen, but the video suggests shifting the punctuation slightly changes the meaning dramatically. It creates this couplet. that who gave so many poets life by one should live, the interpretation. One single poet, Marletrue Shakespeare, was the source, the life-giver, for many other writers' works.
And Alan's connection.
Alan was the star actor in Marlowe's big plays like Tamburlaine and Faustus. So linking him to this idea of a single source strengthens the Marlowe connection.
Plus, there's no record of Alan being in Jonson's plays.
Apparently not much contemporary evidence, no. Suggests his main theatrical ties were perhaps elsewhere with Marlowe's works.
Okay, let's shift gears. What about Shakespeare's death? That diary entry by John Ward.
Right, the merry meeting. Shakespeare, Drayton, and Jonson supposedly have drinks. Shakespeare gets a fever and dies.
Seems straightforward, but the video raises questions.
Yeah, like, what were Jonson and Drayton doing in Stratford right then? Was there another reason for the visit?
And Drayton? The video suggests he might be another pseudonym.
It revisits that theory. Michael Drayton, another potential mask for Marlowe Shakespeare. If true, that meeting looks very different, doesn't it? Maybe it wasn't just a casual get-together.
It implies a much deeper connection, maybe related to the whole hidden identity thing?
Could be. Then there's the timing issue with Jonson listing Shakespeare as an actor.
When did that happen?
Only in 1616, in the collected works of Jonson, which is coincidentally the year Shakespeare died and when Folio preparations might have been starting.
So Jonson's silent about him for years, then suddenly lists him as a principal actor right around the time of his death and the Folio project.
It feels a bit convenient. Or inconsistent, maybe.
In Shakespeare's will.
Yeah.
Another puzzle piece.
Yeah, the video asks, why doesn't the will mention Ben Jonson? You know, the guy who's about to ensure his immortal fame with the Folio.
You'd expect a mention, maybe a token left him.
Or his patron, the Earl of Southampton. Apparently Southampton didn't publicly acknowledge Shakespeare's death either. It seems odd for a supposed patron.
So the man who wrote the eulogy isn't in the will, the patron ignores the death.
And Jonson himself stays quiet about the death until the Folio Commission years later. Contrast that with Jonson's own death. Lots of accounts survive about that. It just feels different.
Okay, back to the Folio itself. The Drushout engraving, the portrait. What's the issue there?
The video points out the lack of a shadow in the first Folio engraving. It looks flat, maybe unrealistic.
Okay, so?
Then it contrasts this with sonnets in the second Folio, which talk about a non-realistic shadow corresponding to the famous poet.
A shadow, mentioned later.
Yeah, and the video links this, plus other oddities in the second Folio, like mirroring, a misplaced laurel wreath, a reversed publisher's name to the idea of pure, unadulterated fakery. Like the second edition is subtly hinting the first image wasn't quite right.
A visual riddle across editions, that's intricate.
It seems that way. Then there's this business with identical poems.
Identical?
Almost identical, about an hourglass. One by Jonson, one anonymous, both around 1640. The anonymous one is presumed to be by the still-living true Shakespeare Marlowe.
And the difference.
Small textual changes, but the anonymous one ends with this line, "His ashes takes no rest."
Suggesting the person isn't peacefully dead and buried.
Exactly. And the story gets better. Jonson apparently gave this hourglass poem, attributing it to the anonymous author of a collection called Wit's Recreations to someone named William Drummond.
Okay.
This supposedly made the real author, Marlowe, angry, because in epigram 126, the author claims he showed Jonson those verses personally, implying Jonson knew who really wrote it and shouldn't have given it away like that.
So even in 1640, years after Stratford Shakespeare's death, there's this echo of the real author, still interacting, still maybe annoyed with Jonson.
That's the interpretation, a lingering presence, asserting ownership.
And there's another poem overlap with William Bassa.
Yeah, Bassa wrote a poem about Shakespeare's burial, suggesting he should be buried in Westminster Abbey with other great poets.
Okay.
The video points out striking similarities in phrasing and imagery between Bassa's poem and Jonson's first Folio eulogy.
So similar to that.
It raises the question, who was William Bass? Could that name also be a pseudonym for the true Shakespeare Marlowe?
Good grief. How many pseudonyms are we talking about potentially?
It does seem to expand the network, doesn't it? And then there's the Holland connection. Professor Ian Donaldson's research showing Jonson spent time in Holland.
Right.
Well, that coincides with periods when Marlowe was known to be in Holland after his supposed death in Deptford.
So they might have actually met up abroad.
It opens that intriguing possibility. The video even mentions a rumor of a painting. Jonson and Marlowe playing chess in Holland. Maybe linked to George Wither's emblem book from Leiden.
A painting. Wow. That would be something. Is Wither another potential pseudonym?
The video suggests Witter might be another Marlowe alias, yes. It gets complex.
It certainly does.
Mm.
What about other candidates, like Thomas Middleton?
The video briefly mentions Professor Gary Taylor's work suggesting Middleton co-wrote or contributed to some Shakespeare plays.
Right, the other Shakespeare idea.
But the video questions it by looking at mottos used by Taylor and George Wither around the same time, 1621. It argues the lack of connection suggests they aren't two separate authors, but likely the same author, Marlowe Shakespeare, exploring duality under different guises.
So, one mind behind multiple outputs exploring different themes.
That's the overarching theory. It tries to unify these disparate threads.
Okay, let's look at the very beginning. Shakespeare's first published work, Venus and Adonis, the Latin title lines.
From Ovid, an elegy about poets achieving eternal fame after death.
Standard classical reference, maybe?
Perhaps, but Marlowe himself translated that same elegy, and his translation ends powerfully with, "I will live." Defiant.
Okay. And Jonson.
Jonson also translated it later, but his version emphasizes the body falls in funeral fire, even though the name shall live. A different focus.
So the question is, why would Shakespeare's debut work start with a quote often associated with the deceased poet Ovid, but by implication maybe Marlowe, who had recently died?
Especially when Marlowe's own translation of it ended on such a note of survival, it feels like a potential coded message right from the start.
And Jonson used this Ovid elegy too.
Yes, right at the beginning of his satirical play, Poetaster, he uses the closing couplet and references the whole elegy.
And the significance there.
In Poetaster, there's a character called Ovid Jr. The video argues this character symbolically represents Marlowe. Ovid was exiled. Marlowe was effectively exiled after his faked death. The parallels are drawn.
So Poetaster becomes a play about this literary situation, about real poets, pseudo-poets, Jonson and Marlowe.
That's the interpretation offered, yes. A satire reflecting the real-world drama.
Okay, almost there. Jonson meeting John Taylor, the water poet.
Yeah, that meeting is documented. The video again questions Taylor's identity, another potential mask.
And Jonson's play, Every Man in His Humor. There's a character.
Master Matthew, a kind of pretentious poetaster figure.
And the connection to Marlowe.
Matthew actually quotes Marlowe in the play, and Jonson has him claim he writes stuff extempore, off the cuff. The video argues Jonson is equating Matthew with Marlowe Shakespeare.
How so?
Suggesting Matthew, the lesser talent, owes his poetic life and survival, his material, to Marlowe's influence. It's another subtle jab or acknowledgement.
And Francis Bacon also linked someone named Matthew to Marlowe.
Yes, Tobias Matthew. Which brings us to the final complication.
Which is?
There were apparently two men named Tobias Matthew active around that time. One was the son of the Archbishop of York.
And the other?
The theory gets intricate here. It suggests the Archbishop's son was considered lost or unavailable for a time, and another man, perhaps Marlowe himself with the right background, might have adopted the name Tobias Matthew as a convenient cover.
Marlowe posing as Tobias Matthew.
It's proposed as a possibility, supported perhaps by hints in writings by Sir John Harrington, who might have been an insider, allowing Marlowe to move in certain circles while writing under his various pseudonyms.
Wow, that is quite a theory, a complete assumed identity.
It ties a lot of threads together, if you accept the premise.
So wrapping this all up, the core argument we've dug into from the video is that all these weird silences, the cryptic comments, the threats from Ben Jonson, they stop looking random or contradictory if you view them through this specific lens.
Right. The lens of Christopher Marlowe not actually dying in 1593, but being hidden, protected maybe even by the state, the crown, the nobility, and allowed to continue writing under the Shakespeare name, and maybe others too. Jonson knew, and his writings reflect that hidden knowledge.
So the key takeaways, the sort of nuggets we've pulled out. Jonson's very specific lack of personal references to the Stratford man. These veiled, sometimes critical, sometimes threatening references in his poems and plays that seem to point at a hidden author, possibly Marlowe.
The inconsistencies around the death, the will, the folio timing.
Yeah, all the bits that don't quite add up in the standard story.
Yeah.
And this persistent, complex possibility of Marlowe living on, writing under Shakespeare, maybe Drayton, maybe Bass, maybe even posing as Tobias Matthew.
It's a compelling, if controversial, alternative narrative.
And I guess the final thought, the really provocative question for you listening is, what if? What if even just part of this is true?
How fundamentally does that change how we read these works, how we understand Elizabethan literary history?
Yeah, and what other secrets, what other interpretations might be hiding there in plain sight in texts we thought we knew so well?
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Definitely worth digging into the sources and thinking about the implications.
Absolutely. It gives you a lot to chew on. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us into the world of Ben Jonson and the Shakespeare authorship secret.